Welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm Ray Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
Thank you for joining us today. And this is a kind of an impromptu, I guess we'll call it a bonus episode. So we're recording this actually on September 11th, which I think is kind of an interesting time to be doing this. And we're doing it in kind of response to a couple events, but kind of maybe the catalyst that got us here today was the assassination of Charlie Kirk last night, as well as a high school shooting happening in Colorado, and those events really happening on kind of the tail end of a whole lot of things that have happened since, I guess, almost a year ago with the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and then the Houtman murder in Minnesota, and a whole lot of stuff. And so, I reached out to Paul this morning and said, hey, I think I want to do this episode. And part of it was in response to be honest, me being disappointed in my friends. And yesterday being on social media and seeing people's reaction to Charlie Kirk's death. And we're not going to be a politically charged necessarily conversation, but really was my disappointment in the people in my life was seeing those on one side really demonizing, the left and saying, this is a war and this really intense kind of response. And then on the other end, having friends who were just saying really nasty things about somebody who had just died, and I, shared with Paul, even a response that somebody put that they hope Charlie Kirk's children don't grow up to be like him. And I'm like, wow, I wouldn't want to say that in any situation about somebody, but to now say that in a social media platform. So we thought we would just kind of do an episode talking a little bit about perception and I think maybe response to this. And
yes.
So, I don't even know, where do we want to start, Paul?
Yeah. Well, I think you called out a year ago. I think it was right around that time frame when the Donald Trump assassination and Jack Black's statement. And and so he was sharing about how he's he has no love for Donald Trump's policies. However, he'll never condone hate speech or encourage political violence in any form. And that was in response to one of his best friends and bandmate at the time. And it really kind of threw things into some discourse there. Yeah. And I think that's such an important message because whether you identify as Republican or Democrat, we can come back to that unifying, we're all Americans, even on a more global scale, we're all people. And the idea that someone's children don't have their father right now, that's an awful thing. And so it's the importance behind this message of perception when we can become so ingrained in a singular belief, especially how dangerous that is. And I think there's this message that we're wanting to identify that we need to be open to different ideas. And if we get to a point where we're not hearing anything that we disagree with, how really concerning that is. And so, and I don't mind sharing personally, I don't align with those beliefs, but that doesn't mean that I celebrate death. That's an awful thing. And wanting to make sure that we're not so tied up with our political beliefs that we're then compromising on moral beliefs of hey, should someone be killed for sharing their opinion?
Yeah, I even, for me, it was, such a terrible situation. And I'm kind of with you. I again, don't know that I really had many thoughts that were aligned with some of what Charlie Kirk talked about. But I have to say, I respected how he was willing to stand in front of crowds and have people debate ideas. And I respect anybody that's willing to talk and have debate about different things. And I think that my piece of this was, I disagree with ideas, but that doesn't mean I hate people.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it kind of differs. And I think I love the fact that I have friends that have differing opinions. And I love listening to debate and doing those things. But that doesn't change the way that I view them as humans. And I think that this situation for me became a situation where I think I've seen how much we villainize people instead of just being like, hey, we completely disagree with their ideas. I can hate ideas, but I don't know if I hate people.
And, wanting to share a quote that as we were talking, it just just kind of searching, and I think this really captures an important piece. So it's a quote by John Moore, and it's, "Your opinion is your opinion. Your perception is your perception. Do not confuse them with facts or truths. Wars have been fought and millions have been killed because of the inability of men to understand the idea that everybody has a different viewpoint." And I think that's such an important piece, because if we expect everyone to align, that's as far as that's never going to happen, nor should it in a way. And that's my opinion that it shouldn't, but really making sure that, like, when we're talking about these concepts, like that, we want to have openness to compassion. We want to have openness to understanding. I think it's, again, the debate piece. I think it's wonderful to encourage an effective debate. And I think debate is wonderful when it finally kind of starts to, someone starts to cue and be like, I never thought about it that way, or I never heard of, never heard of that statistic, or, I'm not familiar with that concept. Let me go and learn more. And I think that's one of the great things about being human, is like our capacity for learning and understanding. However, that's a really dangerous thing, because we also then view that through that lens of, and we are right, when this is just the best information that we have in this current moment, and it's open to change.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, I love the idea of debate. And like I said, I don't really know a whole lot about Charlie Kirk. I've seen the clips that probably most people have seen on social media. But yeah, I think that's the idea. Like I said, didn't agree with a lot of things. There were some things I thought were interesting. There were some things that made me think differently. And I think that's with anybody. Like, man, it doesn't matter like what somebody's ideology is. I'm always willing to listen and to take that in. And I don't take it personal when it's not my belief. And I think that's the part yesterday that I think not, and we're talking about yesterday because it's so recent, but I mean, gosh, this isn't a new situation that's happened in 24.
No, it is not.
Yeah. So it's this idea that, it always turns out the same way, though. I think that was in the last 24 hours for me, is I just keep seeing the same bad behavior from people. That's the frustrating part.
And this assigning of blame, the reactiveness. And again, I think, at a time when, again, not only Charlie Kirk, yesterday was also a school shooting again.
Yeah, again.
And this idea of like, how do we help just support others? And I think like that's the message. And it's not a new message either, but it's a message that oftentimes I think gets drowned out by hatred. And because, opinions are so like, when you hear your own opinion, it's like, oh yeah. And then we want more and we want more. We stop thinking with compassion. We also stop being curious. Like, when you're talking about that idea of like, some of Charlie Kirk's perspectives that you found curious. I've been, Charlie Kirk has been blowing up my news feed, and yet it's only in this moment in the recording I had thought like, I wonder where in Charlie Kirk's life those ideas were formed. And that's not in a dismissive way. It's in a curious way. And I think, again, when we have certainty in our perceptions, when we view ourselves as absolute truth, or having absolute truth, then we diminish any need for curiosity. And that's really the stagnation. We've talked about risks like that in other areas. Like we've talked about AI and some of those risks and concerns of we solely rely on AI. It's just going to be regenerating the same ideas and same concepts. There's no curiosity. There's nothing new. Mm-hmm. So we need to continue to evoke change, to evoke different ideas, trying new things, not holding on to beliefs so strongly that we're not willing to be questioned or that we're not willing to answer questions about it, and open to, hey, if there's really, really good and compelling information, can it change my belief?
Yeah. Well, that's a great comment. I always wonder, like, when we hear somebody give a different opinion or a different thought than our own, are we listening to respond and defend our belief, or are we listening to understand? And I think that goes in a lot of different ways of communication. But when we talk about like couples counseling, right? Yeah. When you think about couples counseling, what do they say? Like, don't listen to respond, just listen to understand. And I think it's something I in my life, I love listening to differing opinions, and I'm not trying to come up with a response in that moment. I might at some point, and especially if I am debating someone, but my first thought is always like, I just want to hear it. I want to try it. And I think we throw around curious all the time on these episodes, but it is such a great word, because I am curious about why people think the way they do. And maybe that will change my opinion, and maybe it won't. But sometimes it does. Sometimes it and at the end, even if it doesn't, I respect the diversity. I don't, I had said this to Paul as we were kind of talking. I'm more afraid that we stop having different opinions. Like, I think the worst thing that could happen for us as in humanity is that everybody thinks the same way. I think that's what a cult is. Like, I think that's, I think that's a dangerous place to go. And I think we evolve as a society by having that, it's almost like the yin and yang kind of thing. Like you got to have both. And it's what makes things great. And when we get to a point that we're trying to silence that, that's a problem. I'd rather argue with it. I'd rather have a discussion. And I have to realize that sometimes my opinion will not win. And that's okay. Like I'm not that narcissistic that I believe my way has to always be the way. That doesn't mean I'm not going to keep arguing my point. Doesn't mean but it's just part of what we have to do. So I think, for me, my thoughts right now and my own self-reflection is, one, how do I be a better person to other people? How do we focus on the human element? And, so we've had so many episodes that talk about the importance of how we treat other people and the connections we have with other people. And if we're going to solve, I think, a lot of problems, that's where we have to start. And so that's been my reflection. And the other is, how can I make sure that I am appreciating people's opinions, even if they're not ones that I'm ever going to agree with? I'm going to at least be curious and want to hear it.
And when you talked about human, like that piece, there's a one of my grad school courses was in a person-centered psychology class, and a really kind of like a strong focus on Carl Rogers. And I remember the way that my professor kind of presented this, the idea of active listening. And active listening is not a new concept. And, if you're listening to this, you're probably somewhere interested or related to the mental health field. You've heard of the term active listening. But the way that my professor shared, if we're actively listening, we are able to then reflect back what we hear, not verbatim, but doing it in our own words in a way that person on the other side says, yes, you get it. Like, that is exactly where I'm coming from. And they emphasize the importance of, we don't have to agree to understand. And so when we're actively listening, that's kind of that active curiosity. Is this right? Is this the angle? Is this the perspective that you're experiencing this from? And, when you're throwing it back to the couples counseling piece, that's where I start. Anytime there's any sort of relational conflict, it's, what are you hearing them say? And is that actually what they're saying? And it's not the ultimate fix, but man, is it a good start? And, if we're able to then refine that skill of listening to understand versus listening to respond, then we have a point of mutual understanding that we get to, start working from. And what a better place of mutual understanding, not mutual agreement. It's, okay, we can have diverse ideas, but now it's you and I working together, you understanding me and also reciprocating it, me understanding you. Like, it's, how do we then work together against this concern or this issue, rather than it being a me versus you? And so we're then creating a more of a triangulation effect rather than we're butting heads. And so I think that's what we need more of, is listen to understand, actively listen to understand. And then how do we come together to resolve these issues and concerns? And you're right, it's not always going to be in agreement or in our favor, but there's something so refreshing about feeling heard.
Well, and I think the other piece is keeping it that we dislike the ideas, even, so we hear them, and it's okay to disagree with them and dislike them. That doesn't mean we have to hate or villainize the person. There was, since you brought up Rogers, I guess we'll have to put in more psychology quotes in or things in here. But Al Ellis used to have had a quote that was, and I'm going to paraphrase. I don't know if I'll get it exactly right, but it was something like, "There's no such thing as good people and bad people. There are people who do good things, and there are people who do bad things." And that when we view things like that, it's a very different perspective, right? So like at the end of the day, we're people, we're humans. And I would extend his quote to say, there are people with good ideas and there are people with bad ideas, but they're still people first. And we can dislike their ideas. We can agree with their ideas. We can dislike their ideas. But at the end of the day, being human with each other is important, and encouraging that debate. I just never want to see that go.
I think that's really captures the message of, make sure that when we're engaging with others in debate, when we disagree, it is the idea. How do we still show respect and care for the person? Because I know if someone disagrees with me, I want them to, to engage with respect and care. Like, I don't want them, like, if I say, hey, this is what I think, I don't want this big blow up or this big reaction. I want them to be like, well, why do you think that? And I want it to be this debate. I don't want to just be seen in a singular way.
Right.
And again, it's perspective. How do we broaden our perspective, try to get the largest and clearest picture that we can, with also the recognition of that picture will be imperfect and we will never have true clarity, but the pursuit of that's going to lead to greatness.
That's right. And let people disagree with us. I'm fine with people telling me they disagree. That's okay. My feelings don't get hurt by that. But I'm probably going to ask you why, and I want to hear that piece of it. But I'm glad we got a chance to maybe for a short episode, just kind of chat a little bit about, I think, maybe a complex topic. We have so many other episodes. It kind of came to mind as we were doing about agreeing and disagreeing. But, if we can encourage everybody to pause and maybe think before we post or say something, and just reflect on ourselves a bit, and how can we respond in a way that humanizes people instead of dehumanize people, I think could be a powerful message.
A message we need to spread more of. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back next week. But until then, be well, stay psyched.